Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, in the studio with Waubgeshig Rice. His new book is called Moon of the Turning Leaves. It's the follow-up to Moon of the Crusted Snow. Welcome to the show.
Michael, thanks for having me.
I want to start in the acknowledgments because you write about how, if it hadn't been for the fans of the first book, the second book wouldn't exist. Now, was it like the popularity of the book, or was it that you hadn't considered following up on this book, like a demand amongst people for more of this story forced you to think, is there more of this story?
Yeah, that was exactly it. When I finished the first book and got it ready to print and it got out there, I saw the characters as riding off into the sunset. I was done with them. It was a story I wanted to tell, and I was happy with how it all came together, and I was just excited to have the novel out there, right? Mm-hmm. And then, I was thinking about other things. But when I started doing some public events and, had interactions on social media, people would ask me about a sequel, and at first I said no, because I was being honest. I hadn't thought of it, right? And people would, be kind of disappointed. So I thought, I better fudge the truth a little bit just to give them something, right? And I started saying, I'm thinking about it. And then after repeating that so many times, I eventually convinced myself that, maybe I should, plant an idea back there and just see what happens.
So when you close the book on that first one, then, like you said, they're riding off into the sunset. Yeah. How do you get yourself into the headspace of going back to this community, going back to these characters? Do you have to reread that first book, or what exercise gets you there?
Well, it really began with that enthusiasm from readers who wanted to see next one, and I just sort of tapped into that appreciation that they had for the characters, and even the love and care that I saw readers express for the characters themselves was really powerful, and it was kind of overwhelming to know that these are fictional people who've lived in my head for a long time, but have had a reach with people out in the real world. So in some ways, I felt like I owed it to the characters themselves to bring them back to life, so to speak, and sort of reimagine a new future for them. So I did have to go back to a lot of my original notes, because I did set the story 10 years after the end of the first book. So there's some changes in some of the characters. I had to sort of remind myself of some of the relationships amongst them, in terms of continuity, how old some would be at one point, what they might look like, and so on. So I didn't necessarily reread the entire first book, but I went through all the notes that I had made at the time of writing it, just to make sure everything lined up.
So those notes, like personality traits, yep, things they'd gone through, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing, because before actually writing out the first draft of the first book, I would write out these character profiles of each character, with personality traits, appearance, relationships with other characters, et cetera, et cetera. And I also had these rough outlines of the actual narrative, of the plot and so on. And then other notes about the setting and, some things I'd saved through the research, even just web pages and, scans of documents I'd researched and so on. So, but the thing is, because I was doing this while I was working as a journalist, all this material was scattered all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. Different drives, different email accounts, and so on. So that was a task in and of itself to bring it all back together.
A bit of a hunt and sifting.
A bit of a hunt, yeah.
So you said, 10 years on, did you think about what had happened in the interim so that to get you where, say Evan is to start this book, what happened in those 10 years? And is it, a hardening or a refinement of what his character was at the end of the first book? What kind of thoughts did go through you in terms of character development or the change in those people?
Yeah, that was one of the funnest parts of the process, and also most challenging and also one of the most introspective too, because I thought about how I would age over a 10-year span. What would change about me, what sort of traits or values would be refined or would be discarded maybe even. So Evan is essentially going from his mid-20s to his mid-30s, right? And that's a big leap for anybody. You grow a lot in that amount of time. So yeah, I had to think about how, he would be hardened in some ways because they have survived, yet another massive trauma to them collectively. and he's becoming he's a father to two young people who are becoming, you know, their own adults, right? And as they're faced with this new challenge or this new goal, then he has to sort of think about how his daughter, you know, walks through that world that they're going to explore.
So his daughter, was it intentional to give that 10-year gap to get her into like young adulthood, like to put her as like a teenager who's kind of becoming an adult?
Yeah, exactly. That was exactly it. I, you know, when I made the decision to put it that far into the future, the reason was to allow the younger generation in the first book to grow, you know, and to be central characters. So I thought, you know, Maingan and Nangos, the boy and the girl, the son and the daughter, you know, they would be at the center of this story somehow. And, you know, it was always going to be a quest story. They were going to go south to see what's left of the world, to try to find a new home and reconnect with their original home on Lake Huron. And I thought one of the kids would go with Evan to embark upon this quest, right? So I thought, you know, the first thought goes to, you know, the son, Maingan. But right away I thought, you know, it's kind of a trope, you know, father, son, buddy adventure story.
Lone wolf and cub.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I found it kind of boring, even though I'm a dad to 3 boys, right? Mm-hmm. But for that particular reason, I thought, well, I really want Nangos, the girl, to be one of the main characters, you know, to provide a strong female lead character for my sons to read as they grow up, right? You know, it's important for them to see that. So that was, you know, kind of exciting to do, kind of scary, you know, to figure out how to write a teenage girl. But, you know, I found it really rewarding overall to put the focus on her.
So what goes into that in terms of figuring out how to write a teenage girl?
Hanging out with a lot of my nieces and cousins who are teenagers, you know, and not like, you know, prodding them for, you know, what it's like to see the world through their eyes, just to know, just to be amongst them, really, just to sort of absorb their personalities and really be inspired by them, essentially, you know. And I find that with all youth, you know, no matter the gender. When I'm around groups of young Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people, I really see a different view of the future that is inspiring, you know, especially amongst people who are really dedicated to coming together as a community and thinking about the future, reviving traditional ways and that kind of thing, right? Because there's a greater desire amongst the youth to do that compared to when I was that age, you know? So yeah, it was just being around young people is what I wanted to do.
Right. Now you mentioned you knew you were going to have, you know, a second generation as part of this journey, that, like, you know, it would be you know, father and child thing. Did you know that you were going to write from both voices? Like, did you know you were going to have like an interior reflection of Nangos as well as Evan, like that both of them would be processing this same journey?
Yeah, I did, but not to the degree it ended up being. So the first draft is really the first half of the story, primarily relying on Evan's point of view and how he perceives this new challenge and their journey and so on. And then there's a moment about halfway through where Nangos takes on this sort of leadership role. And then I wrote most of the second half from her point of view, right? So it started with Evan and it ended with Nangos. But my editor, Rick Meyer, he suggested bringing her point of view in more strongly earlier on for the sake of character development, of course. You know, like, we want to get to know her if she's in fact going to be this central figure by the end. But also for the sake of world building, because we're looking at the world, you know, 12 years after this blackout, and she barely remembers the time before. All she knows is the natural world, you know, hunting and harvesting, and the relics of the bygone era are entirely foreign to her in many ways, right? So it was really interesting to think about that in terms of like this dystopian world building kind of practice.
Does that create, I don't want to say a problem, but like an obstacle or some sort of difficulty in terms of having someone who hasn't lived through what we're currently living through, seeing kind of the post-apocalyptic version of that? Like, were you trying to intellectually think of what that would be like if you hadn't experienced it now and had like familiarity with it?
Yeah, it was a challenge. And one thing I really didn't want to show was her as naive or maybe immature because of that. instead I wanted to show that she has an advanced knowledge of the natural world around her compared to everything else, right? And the technological industrial world we're reliant upon now is irrelevant. It's gone. So it doesn't matter what she knows about that because she can help them survive on this quest as they go south, So yeah, it's, there's this sort of trope or tendency to infantilize like maybe an indigenous worldview as it relates to like land-based learning. But in a situation like this, that is entirely advantageous to her and to her peers because of what she knows.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You thank Dr. Cormier.
Oh, Corbière, yeah.
Corbière, sorry, for her role in terms of helping you with Anishinaabe. That, like, you, I guess, wanted to include the language naturally within the book, but are not, a fluent speaker. What's the relationship? What's the practice like in terms of like getting her involved in this, and like how does that work in terms of putting it in the book?
Good question. So what I did was like the Anishinaabe you see in the story is the extent of my skill. It's a very basic sort of conversational level of language comprehension. Maybe a toddler's level, right? Maybe a bit more advanced than that. But I didn't want to misrepresent my own skill in writing this story. But I still needed a proofreader. I needed somebody to guide me through, and she became one of my teachers when I moved to Sudbury, 6 years ago. I took some courses with her through the University of Sudbury, which offered Anishinaabe at the time. And I got in touch with her as, these drafts were finishing up. And I said, yeah, can I hire you just to proofread the Anishinaabe? And she was so helpful, she went through everything. She provided like different kinds of context for me. She had suggestions to make things a little more conversational and realistic. All the while, like fully understanding what my intention for the story was and my intention for the language in the story too, and she's just a remarkable resource, and I'm just very thankful she was a part of it.
So did you have to kind of like explain the story to her to get like the gist of like why you're including it, what you're looking like tonally, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I did. And the other thing too is that like she was a big fan of the first book and she really wanted to read this, but I didn't give her like the wholesale draft, right? Because she's like, I want to wait till it's done to read it. So for I would say like maybe the first 2/3, I gave her like the statements or the phrases, the dialogue, etc., and I would contextualize it for her. This is what I've been doing here. This is where they are at this point. But towards the end, she didn't want me to give anything away, right? So I said, okay, well here's just the instances of the language. Yeah. I won't tell you anything about the plot at this point. And in some ways, she like just had to guess, but we were able to talk it through too.
So that doesn't create its own difficulties in terms of like understanding the context. Like, could the language change if she knew?
No, because I was like, I would say this is what I wrote and this is what I want them to say. And I think in that sense that helped there. Those parts of the story where she didn't want anything spoiled for herself, right?
Right. So in terms of interweaving the Anishinaabe, are there certain things are going to be said in that language? Or like how do you kind of figure out when and where it's deployed, within like the dialogue and exchanges between, Evan and Nogons? Like when they do that?
That's a good question. I think, when I talk amongst my family and my peers, most of us aren't fluent speakers, but we do say things in the language that we always have since we were kids, So I think I tried to represent that, just the fact that the language emerges naturally, just randomly, and we say things, in context for sure. But I think throughout, I wasn't like monitoring when it comes up and where, but I wanted to make it somewhat regular, right? So I think it was more or less, I felt like, okay, maybe I should have them saying something in the language here, just to bring it back to the language itself and their identity.
So is that something like on a pass through a draft you're noticing, or is it as you're writing it, you're like, oh, this would be a time to deploy it? Like how, like.
I think it was as I was writing it, I thought, okay, right here, like for example, not to give too much away for the listeners who haven't read it yet, but like when they come across other people who have more advanced skills than they do in the language, those people are going to be speaking the language to them, right? So that was always the intention for those interactions, was that the core group of main characters, they don't have as strong skills as the other people that they encounter. So it was to show that sort of spectrum, I think, of this process of renewal post-apocalypse, and how different people would be at different stages, and that's very much where we're all at now. Like different communities, different families are at different levels of their own language speaking skills and journeys, right? So
And then I gather then like when they do meet these people who are further advanced, that like the way that they are treated is it's like, okay, we will recognize up to a point that you have a limitation, and I gather then that's based on kind of your own experience with other people who maybe are further along in language learning.
Like you'll meet some people, and everybody in my language journey has been so kind and so understanding, but they want to encourage you too. So they'll say, okay, next time you say that to me, say it in the language, not in English, right? So.
Yeah. So that group that they meet, without spoiling kind of where things are at, like you said, they're further along in terms of language. Their journey in some ways starts earlier than Evan's community. Mm-hmm. Did that give you an opportunity to think about like where things would be if Evan had a head start? Like if his community was in a different place?
Yeah, partially. And also part of that was with this particular group, was to really illustrate the divide between North and South socioeconomically, right? Because the people that they come across, no spoiler here, that this won't spoil anything for you. Like they're largely from, cities, and they're Anishinaabe, of course, but they have more access to more resources because they're farther south, and they have more access to more capital too at the same time, which is why they're able to create this place, right? So that's a really good question, and it's something important to highlight. Yeah, if Evan's community was, better placed, or I shouldn't say better placed, but differently situated, and they had different resources, then maybe they would have been at that point too. But
I hadn't thought, like, obviously it's there that like there's like the urban indigenous versus like the rural indigenous. That I was thinking more in terms of like Evan's group has to be kind of reactive to this situation, whereas this group seemed kind of like they weren't necessarily planning for an apocalypse, but they were placed in a place where they'd already kind of had a few steps towards it,
just in case, right? They had a backup plan.
But it also seems to create that like reflect that urban rural and like capital divide, right?
Exactly.
Like an impoverished community versus a more wealthy community. Was that like a conscious thing? Like, are you thinking like oppositional or like differential?
Oh yeah, that was conscious. I grew up on the reserve, but my reserve is by no means isolated. It's right beside the town of Parry Sound, Ontario. It's only about a 2-hour drive north of Toronto now. But living on the reserve, which is on an island, we looked over to the mainland where Parry Sound was, and there's all street lights and running water throughout and stable hydroelectricity. Whereas on the res, it was dark a lot of the time. Like the house I grew up in didn't have hydro or running water or anything like that. So I experienced that disparity firsthand. Between a town and a reserve that are essentially right beside each other, and those disparities happen from reserve to reserve too, depending on where some communities had the fortune of being relocated to, right?
Yeah.
And I use fortune like very loosely because it was tragic for basically everybody to be displaced. But you go from community to community, and there are vast differences in terms of resources, infrastructure, capital, and so on, right? So that was intentional to highlight, even just between North and South, Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario. It's like two worlds essentially, right?
Yeah. You'd mentioned the tragedy of the relocation. This book is a coming home. This journey is back to Lake Huron and to the like original homeland. Was that important? Like that was kind of where this journey would get to?
Like when I started thinking about a part 2 and what the goal would be, yeah, that sort of emerged as the natural objective, you know, as sort of undoing colonialism, like essentially decolonizing, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot, right? You know, they have this opportunity, despite all the terrible things that have happened to them as a result of the blackout. They have this opportunity to freely go back to their homeland if they're able to do so, you know, like, I mean, if they have the skills to make it down there and then resettle, right? So yeah, that was always what I wanted to sort of try to accomplish with the story. And it's just like, you know, of course, you know, you can consider it like fantastical or maybe even ambitiously utopian. But, you know, at the same time, like that act of returning to land happens on a regular basis in communities everywhere. And although it's not like reclaiming, you know, the land that once was, you know, collectively held by groups of people, I think the action of like learning how to harvest berries and herbs and medicines, or learning how to tan a hide, or even just, you know, hunt a moose or something like that. I think those are building blocks to hopefully one day restoring that way of life in a homeland. And you know, we see the community embarking on those things early on in the novel, and that's sort of eventually what sets them up to empower themselves to go on this quest. And yeah, that's sort of fundamentally where those values and objectives lie.
Yeah, certainly. Like they're empowered, and like you said, you know, Nangong's like has these capabilities that make her a natural choice to be part of this party that goes south. But part of the like impulse to go is like resource scarcity.
Yeah.
Was that like an important thing to have like a triggering event that was centered around resources? And
yeah, you know, and that sort of harkens back to the migratory traditions of a lot of indigenous nations. You know, like where I'm from originally, our ancestors traversed the north shore of Lake Huron, you know, according to the season, according to the food supply. And then, you know, our ancestors were confined to these different pockets of land once, you know, Indian Affairs made them, you know, once Canada was settled and so on. So yeah, you know, when they start realizing that they've depleted the resources in this one place, they have the recognition that, you know, historically they were migratory. They moved around to allow the land and the life to replenish itself, and then, you know, they would return after a certain amount of time, right? So that's like the essence of, you know, traditional way of life amongst the Anishinaabe that I wanted to sort of get at the same time. And yeah, just for the characters to remind themselves that, you know, for their own survival, they will have to move on eventually. You know, they just can't be isolated because they have been for, you know, all this time at this point, you know, in the community story. So
begins with a birth.
Yeah.
How important was it that was, you know, and like triggering event, or like how we meet these people now?
Well, I always said about the first book, you know, it's one of renewal. It's an homage to the spirit of regeneration that we're seeing in a lot of Indigenous communities. But in the first book, you know, there's so much death. There's so much despair and destruction, despite the hopeful outcome that I wanted to get to by the end of the first book, right? So from the beginning, I thought, you know, I really need to show something a little more hopeful and something actually regenerative, which is, in a birth is probably one of the best things you could use to represent that, right? So yeah, I wanted to start it with a birth from the beginning. And also in 2020, when I was first starting on dreaming the story up, our second son was born in June of 2020, a few months into the pandemic. And he was just what we needed at that time, because we all remember how difficult those early months of the pandemic were. It was really stressful for us. You know, it was very confusing too, like it was for so many others. But, you know, our little boy coming to us at that time was just medicine. You know, it was very, very healing for us. And, you know, I used that experience, or I drew upon that experience to write that birth scene, essentially.
Oh, to write the scene itself.
Yeah. Because actually, you know, like you see that the baby gets stuck as it's coming out, and that happened to our son too. The same thing. So it was a very stressful birth.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously like a positive thing in terms of for the community, but the event itself is like it's
and it's
traumatic.
just like, it was dramatic, it was real life drama that we lived through. It was very tense, and just like, well, as a writer, it's like, okay, why not tap into that,
Do you ever resist that urge to tap into that? Do you ever kind of want to withhold or feel you should withhold something like personal when you're writing like a fictional story like this?
Maybe not personal, but cultural for sure.
Yeah.
And that's why I consult with people like my dad or aunts and uncles or my cousins. Because, if I call this a Anishinaabe story, which I do, some people are going to think, oh, it's the Anishinaabe experience, even if I preface everything by saying this is just entirely my perspective, my fictional story. Some people will read into it thinking this is what it must be like to be Anishinaabe, this story. So it's really important for me to be careful with the things I reveal about our cultural truths and our history too, So yeah, I have those discussions with people ahead of time. And they'll say, maybe don't reveal too much about that, or, instead of writing about this, maybe include this part of our culture, because that might be a little more informative for people who are unaware of it, or it might be more connective for people who are also Anishinaabe and trying to find that journey at the same time. Those are the things I try to be more careful with. And I think, like, personally, people are going to read into everything anyway as it being like a personal experience of mine. And people will ask, did you, experience this particular moment? And maybe I did, maybe I didn't, right?
So it's kind of meant to be reflective rather than emblematic of an Anishinaabe experience.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Do you think, like, because there does seem to be like 3 acts to this book, like, and that's kind of like structurally kind of more like a movie or a play, right? Rather than a novel doesn't necessarily have to have 3 acts, but like the course of action of this does seem to have 3 acts. Like, do you find yourself thinking like cinematically or structurally in that way?
Maybe like it like this emerged in 3 acts, like I think kind of naturally. Like, the first act is when they're at home, considering their situation, planning to leave and so on. And I see the second act as being like just them walking through the bush, and then the third act begins once they finally encounter people, right? So that's sort of the 3 acts I see in the story. And those were, I think, the 3 foundational things I wanted to get at. It's like reintroduce them, show what's at stake, and the part with them like walking through the bush, like on paper, that's probably the most boring part, when you consider like all the things that happen in the story. But I wanted the land to be not just a setting itself. I wanted it to be a force. And as you see the 6 walkers re-engaging with the land around them, or even discovering it for the first time for some of them, they grow to respect it, they grow to fear it in some ways, but overall they grow to love it, and they understand how it nurtures them, So I really wanted to have that core part of them just being on the land and walking on it and through it, engaging it in the most, I think, pure way as human beings, as a really formative part of the story. And then, of course, once they encounter people, that sort of ups the tension, right?
Right. It seems like, obviously, like it's the bridge to get you to those people and like where the action changes, but it is being like in the middle, the heart of things, right? That the land is central.
Yeah. And the things they experience through the land too, like they experience flooding, the aftermath of a forest fire, and they realize that a lot of the world has changed while they've been, isolated. And even after the collapse of, the state or of civilization, if you want to call it that, the human's impact is still wide-reaching. Carbon is still in the atmosphere. It's still having an impact on natural cycles and so on. So, they really start to consider just, what humans have done and what they can do, like on a more micro level, to, I guess, restore that balance in some ways.
Sure. So when you put the first book to rest, you didn't think, future for these characters. Did you consider that in writing this second one?
Well, I knew I was going to start getting questions about it, right? So with the first one, I said no, and here we are talking about the second one, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to rule it out at all, but I do want to write some other kinds of stories first before I get back to this world. I have a very basic idea for what a part 3 could be, but I don't want to speak it out into existence yet. In case
I'm just asking if you even considered or were forced to consider it because you had to the first time, right? Like you prepared yourself somewhat.
Yeah. So no, I'm preparing myself for potentially going back down that road. But I will say too, like Rick, my editor, he also gave me a really good idea, not for a sequel, but for more of an adjacent story, like a companion kind of story, which I had not even thought of, and it kind of blew my mind when he told me it. So, maybe that'll be something to explore too.
Sure enough. Well, Moon of the Turning Leaves is out now through Random House Canada. Waubgeshig Rice, thanks very much for coming in and talking about it.
Thanks a lot for having me, Michael. I really enjoyed our conversation.